So today we are going to wrap up our Chapter 4 discussion. So we had left off last time talking about different kinds of color mixing, and we ran out of time right before I could finish this discussion, so you may have taken a few moments to watch the video that I linked on the next slide. You may have not. So if you haven't looked into what the two types of color mixing are, I'll do it one more time really quickly here. So we were talking about the fact that most color mixing that people are familiar with is subtractive color mixing. So this is when you're adding things like paint together. And as you're mixing them together, you tend to get darker and darker colors because as you're mixing that together, it's going to reflect less and less light. So we end up at the middle having something fairly close to black. In reality, we will typically see sort of a grayish brown color because it's very hard to get non-reflecting paints. But that's what we're used to seeing, is that subtractive color mixing, because it's pulling out different wavelengths. But what we are going to care about is the opposite of that, and it is additive color mixing. And so this is the idea that white light is made up of all of the possible wavelengths of visible light. So anywhere from 400 nanometers up to 800 nanometers. And so as we add more and more wavelengths, more and more colors of different wavelengths, we're going to get closer and closer to white light. So if we mixed sort of blue, which is on the far left side of our spectrum, and red that was on the far right side of the spectrum, and green that's somewhere in the middle, we're going to get a decent approximation of white. So here, as we add to it, we're getting more color, or we're getting more wavelengths, so we get closer to white. Whereas with subtractive, we're removing those wavelengths and we get closer to black. And so again, there's a nice video that actually shows this happening. It's kind of hard to get it across from still images, so if you're still not quite getting it, that's a very short thing to watch. But we're going to focus in on our additive color mixing. And we're going to use it to figure out how we can have different kinds of cones that allow us to perceive the variety of colors that we have in our world. And so you're going to find that we're going to talk about three different theories. And the first two aren't going to explain everything. So as we're explaining, we're going to point out what they're good at and what they're bad at, and then we're going to find out what's closest to what we believe is happening right now. And so all of these theories start off the same. They start off with this idea that the human eye has three different types of receptors, and those different receptors have differing sensitivities to different wavelengths of light. What that's basically saying is we have three different kinds of cones. So from dissections of eyes, we can see that there are three distinct kinds of cones. That's why all of the theories start with that point. Where they differ is on what those cones do. What do those three different kinds allow us to see? So in this case, for our trichromatic theory, we could break down the name and say, okay, tri meaning three, chroma meaning colors. So this is a theory of three colors. So they say that we have three different kinds of cones, and each cone is sensitive to a different wavelength of light. One for red, one for green, and one for blue. So kind of like we just saw in our additive color mixing model, where some kind of interaction of red on one extreme, blue on the other extreme, and green in the middle should get us sort of everything between white and black and all the colors in between. So all of the colors that we perceive would be made by an additive mixing process. And so how does that concept work? So we can look at this diagram right here where along the bottom they just have the different wavelengths of light. So they've gone into a lot more detail than the general numbers that our text focuses in on. Our text talks about sort of 400 to 700 because those are nice even numbers. Here they've gone down to, what is that, 390 and up to 740. And that's just because it kind of depends on where you make that cutoff. We don't care too much about the specifics, so don't panic about the axis there. What we do care about is that it goes from sort of the blue-purple all the way over to the red in the right color order. And when we're looking on our y-axis, that vertical axis, that's just giving us a measure of how responsive each of those three types of cones are depending on what frequency they're exposed to. So let's focus in on that blue curve. And the peak of that blue curve is at about 440 nanometers. Again, the specific numbers don't matter, but what that says is if that cone was experiencing exactly that wavelength of light, it would be firing very aggressively. So we would have rapid firing to tell us that that is exactly what frequency it has. If we are a little bit above or a little bit below that frequency, that wavelength, we're going to sort of drop off in responding. So the further away we are from that peak, the less responding we see. And so that would be kind of problematic if we only had one kind of cone, because how do we know if it's closer to purple or closer to green? We can't. But because we have more than one kind, we would say, okay, so from the level of responding that we have for blue, it's either sort of this kind of blue or that sort of that kind of purpley blue. What else is going on? What kind of firing are we seeing from our green sensitive cones? If we see any firing at all from the green sensitive cones, then we're saying, oh no, it's on the green side of the scale. And if we don't have any firing, then it's going to be on that purple side of the scale. And so our brain in the background is able to interpret these different levels of firing from these three different kinds of cones to tell us exactly what wavelength of light we're being exposed to. So we can sort of put together and process those three different kinds of signals to tell us what we're seeing at each position in our retina. And this does a fantastic job for a lot of colors, but you might notice that our red and our green curves are really, really close together. And we have a little bit of an issue where in that sort of peak area, that's where our yellows are, sort of a yellowy green, yellow, and then even into orange, where our two curves for green and red are fairly close together. And so from this theory, we actually have a hard time being able to precisely tell apart different shades of yellow. So that's one of the major drawbacks of this type of theory. But it does a good job on anything else, so it's stuck around for quite a long time. And I don't think I mentioned this before, but this theory was proposed back in the mid-1800s. So these are theories that have been around for a really long time. And if you've learned about this theory before, you might have seen it also called the Young-Helmholtz or Helmholtz theory, and that's just because it was described first by two scientists, Young and Helmholtz. But as per usual, I'm not a huge fan of names or dates, so trichromatic theory is sufficient. And so we said, okay, it doesn't do a fantastic job of explaining yellow, but what it does do is an amazing job at explaining color blindness. So some people have trouble differentiating between different colors. And most people that we see who are colorblind end up being what are called dichromats. And so from that same route before, where we had our trichromatic theory looking at three different color-sensitive cones, dichromats logically then only have two color-sensitive cones. So they are missing either their red sensitive cones, their blue sensitive cones, or their green sensitive cones. And depending on which one they're missing, they might have trouble differentiating between different kinds of colors. Most people tend to be what is called red-green colorblind. They have trouble telling red and green apart. And that actually kind of comes from missing either the red or the green cones. So that would be why that is the most common type. And so for anyone who is curious about color blindness, I found a neat website that when I can go into this in more detail, I like to talk about even more, but it's just for your information. They show you images, how they are normally, and then how they look through a filter that approximates different kinds of color blindness. including the 3 types of dichromatic insensitiveness, as well as people who are monochromats, so people who only have one kind of cone. What do different scenes look like if they're sort of missing their red or their green or their blue? So it's kind of a neat site to take a look at. And I find for some of us, I have a bunch of family members who are colorblind. And from the genetic perspective, it's one of those sex-linked traits where it's a lot more likely to see it in men. So I have a string of my family where the sort of my uncle and all of his male children are all colorblind, but nobody else in the family is. So it's one of those neat things where it gets passed down that way. But yeah, so just little bits of extra information if you're curious about color blindness. So for our trichromatic theory, does a great job explaining color blindness. It pretty much explains how we can see most colors. The downside is its ability to explain yellow. And there are a couple other things it doesn't do a great job of. So what's our next theory? And so this one was talked about in sort of the later 1800s, and this one was proposed by Huring, and this is our opponent process theory. And so once again, we have names that give us useful information. So opponent process, basically telling us that we have 2 opposing processes, 2 things that are going on. And this theory starts off exactly the same as the other one. The human eye has 3 types of receptors with differing sensitivities to different wavelengths of light. Exactly the same. But where they differ now is how they are sensitive. So here, instead of saying that we have sort of 1 blue sensitive, 1 green sensitive, and 1 red sensitive, now we're saying that each of those 3 types of cones is responsible to 2 opposing wavelengths. So the first type is responding to red or green. And so if we look at our sort of curves here, red and green are separated by all of the sort of yellows in the middle. So we should never see red and green as the same color at once, because if we were getting both of them, they'd be mixing together and giving us yellow. So that's not possible to see sort of both at the same time. We can only ever see one or the other. So it kind of makes sense. Okay, so we have 1 type of cone that responds to red or green. So if we wanted to sort of simplify this, because again, we can go into tons more detail. This is one of those topics where I think it's a 3rd year class that I'm teaching next semester, all about sensation and perception. So they have multiple chapters on this. But think of it like an on versus an off signal. So when that cone is firing, it's saying red, and then when it stops, it's saying green, or something similar to that. So it would have different rates of responding that mean different things to our brain. And then for our blue and yellow, same thing. We should never see blue and yellow at the same time because they're separated on our spectrum. Blue being on the far side and then yellow being over there between red and green. So we'd never see blue and yellow at the same time. So our second type of cone would fire for blue or yellow. And then the last one being black or white. So similar to how we know our rods work. And so this is saying that, okay, so when we're seeing colors, it's a combination of sort of these opposing processes. We're seeing one or the other. And this does a great job, again, explaining yellow, because now yellow has its own designated signal. So that gives us some of the information that we were missing from the last explanation, and we don't lose the ability to explain blue or red or green. So it's giving us a little bit more. Mm-hmm.
So when they're saying like each cone sees one or the other, would it be like per cone basis? Is like one cone could be blue, one cone could be yellow?
So it would be one of them does blue and yellow. So it's like the 3 categories are blue or yellow, and then the next one is red or green, and the next one is black or white. Yeah, so they're doing both. So it's a little bit more complex where it's not like an on or off. It's more of a on in this pattern or on in that pattern, where it's saying sort of this color or that color. But yeah, we don't talk enough about how neurons can do more than just fire and not fire. But yeah, so we can get a little bit more information there that just tells us, is it firing in the blue pattern or is it firing in the yellow pattern? So only 3 kinds, and they do pairs. Cool. And so the really good thing that this theory does is explain after images. And I absolutely love showing this image because if you went to school in Canada, you see this and you immediately know what it is. And if not, I will explain it very briefly, but you would have this in a science textbook. They would get you to stare at the black dot in the middle, and you stare at it, don't move your eyes, try not to blink, give it 20 seconds or so, maybe 30 seconds, and then look at a blank sheet of paper or a white wall, and you should see the opposite colors. So the green turns into red, and the black turns into white. So this turns into a Canadian flag. And so this is the idea that when we're staring at this, our green-red cones are saying green really, really fast because they're staring at green for a really long time. But they get tired of saying green all the time. So when you look away, they overcompensate in the other direction. They said green so much that when they got to stop, it ended up saying red. And the same with black and white. It saw black so much, it reported black so much, that when you looked away, when that stimulus vanished, it kind of overcompensated and went the other way and said white. So these after images are a phenomenal way to go along with our opponent process, because if you stare at blue, you see yellow. If you stare at yellow, you see blue. Green turns red, red turns green, black to white, white to black. So that's how they got to this theory. But okay, so this works for after images, but it doesn't work for color blindness. The other one worked for color blindness, but didn't work for yellow or after images. So what is it actually? What is the real thing that's going on? And our simplified version of the current theory is the dual process theory. And at the most basic level, it's just a straight combination of the good parts of both the trichromatic theory and our opponent process theory. So we're back to this idea of 3 types of cones, and they're sensitive to different wavelengths. But if we hop to this next slide here, we have those cones at the top. So we have our 3 cones. We're back to our red and green and blue. But we add in that next line of cells. So these are our opponent cells, the ones that give us the opponent process, and they're going to receive information from those individual cones, and they're going to activate in particular patterns that say either red or green, blue or yellow, black or white. And so you can see the colored lines drawn there. In order to get yellow, we have a mixture of green and red, because if you remember, the yellow was in between green and red on that spectrum. And then for the red and green one, we just get signals from the red and green, and then black and white is a combination of all of them. And so we do know now that these cells that do that opponent process are called the lateral geniculate nucleus cells, or LGN cells. And they can be in the retina and or the visual cortex, and they're basically a way of translating that information from those 3 kinds of cones into that blue or yellow, red or green, black or white, in a way that our brain can read it. So we have basically taken the best of both worlds and stuck them together to get our dual process theory. So we have 2 processes, 3 different kinds of color sensitive cells, and an opponent process cell to explain everything. All right, so that was very sort of neuroscience / biology heavy. Next, we're going to start getting into some of the perception and making meaning of what we're seeing. So the more psych-based stuff. And this is one of my favorite parts to teach about. So we're going to start off with depth perception. And this is how we use visual cues to figure out how close or far an object is from us. And when we look at these types of cues, we can put them into two big categories. We can have monocular cues or binocular cues. And if we break it down into roots again, mono meaning one, bi meaning two, and ocular meaning eyes. So our monocular cues, you only need one eye to be able to use them. So it's not relying on the fact that we have two eyes doing anything fancy. But the binocular cues, those rely heavily on the fact that we have two eyes in very slightly different positions on our head. And I found it really helped me understand this because my father is blind in one eye, but he still plays baseball, and he taught me how to pitch, and all of these things that really require depth perception. But he relies entirely on those monocular depth cues and does just fine in the world. So it's kind of neat that you can get by without one type or the other. But when trying to conceptualize our monocular depth cues, the easiest way to do this is to think about a two-dimensional painting. If you've ever taken an art class or been forced to draw perspective pieces, you've used monocular depth cues. And you deal with monocular depth cues all the time in your life. But it's nice and easy to think about, okay, if you were looking at a picture of something where there is no depth, there is no difference based on which eye you're viewing it with, would this cue, would this information still help me decide if it's closer or further away? So let's run through these with some examples just to explain how these work. So the first of these is occlusion, and this is the idea that something that is closer to you will occlude or block something that is further away. So this podium is closer to you than I am. So you can't see all of me, my legs are hidden because the podium is in the way. So because this is occluding something behind it, you know that it's closer to you than the thing that's behind it. We also have this idea of relative height and relative size, which are very closely related. But this is okay, so you're looking at two cars, and one of them looks a lot bigger or taller than the other. Well, cars tend to be about the same size, more or less, so the one that looks bigger or taller is probably closer to you than the one that looks smaller or shorter. Same with people. People tend to be about human-sized. So if you saw two people who were different heights, if it also came with sort of a comparative lack of width as well, you might assume that it's based on distance. And these aren't completely infallible as individual things. We have to combine a lot of them. But this is another of those things that our brain does a phenomenal job of in the background, and we don't even know that it's doing it. The next one we can talk about is perspective convergence. And this is that one when you were in an art class and they got you to draw a horizon line and put a dot, a vanishing point in the middle, and then you would draw some lines that sort of tapered down to that vanishing point. Maybe it was a street that you were drawing that faded into the distance, or railroad tracks that vanished off at that horizon. But it's the idea that things that are sort of parallel, so railway tracks are always the same width apart. If we were doing a street, that street is 2 lanes apart, it's going to be approximately the same width. So those lines are technically parallel, but as they get further away from us, they look like they converge. So we have this perspective where we see them as though they are getting closer together. But what we know is that they're just getting further away, and as they get further away, they start looking smaller. So it's an illusion of convergence. They're not technically touching, but it looks like they are. The next one is familiar size. So this is pretty close to that relative height and size. And this is just that we have a basic understanding of how large things tend to be. So maybe you don't have to see 2 cars, one that is large and one that is small, to know which one is closer or further away. Maybe you just see a car. And because it is very big, you know that it is very close to you. So you would like to move out of the way. Or again, with people, someone who looks overly tall might just be really close. And then the last one is atmospheric perspective. And this one's really interesting, and it is based on the idea that as something gets further away from you, there's more air between you and that point. So we saw this a lot more extreme in the last little while with all of those smoke days. So when there's smoke in the air, it's not just air particles between you, it's also smoke particles. So things that are further away look more gray and blurry and hard to see. So as things get further away, even without smoke, they look less bright, less intense in color. We see less detail, and the outline of them is less sharp and defined. This is actually something, just a little bit of a tangent. When you watch movies that are supposed to be shot in space, so when they're doing a science fiction show and you see things in space, they run into this issue where in space there's no air between you and that distant point. So you don't have an atmospheric perspective. So everything looks sharp and crisp, it's just further away. And it actually tricks us into thinking that it looks fake and sort of stylized because they're not giving the blur that it should have at the distance. But it's actually supposed to be like that. That's just one of my little pet peeves when I watch really bad science fiction movies, that they don't necessarily follow this. But it's sort of one of those things you wouldn't think of until you take this class. But yeah, that's my little rant for the day. So those are some of our monocular depth cues. We have lots of different ones that we could talk about, but as you can see with those, they don't really rely on any special information from one eye versus the other. Just the fact that you can see, period, means that you can use these cues. So that's why I use the example of if it works on a two-dimensional image, if it worked in a painting or a drawing, then it works as a monocular depth cue. Our other cues, the binocular depth cues, these are where it gets interesting. And this is where we rely on the fact that we have two eyes that are placed at slightly different locations. So almost exactly like when we were talking about localizing sound using ears in different positions, we're using our eyes at slightly different positions in order to figure out how far away things are. So with our first one, we can look at retinal disparity. And this is the idea that objects are going to project slightly different images onto our retinas based on which eye it is that's looking at the item. The easiest way to actually see this is to put your finger in front of your face and close one eye and then the other. And you'll find that it looks like your finger is shifting back and forth just a little bit. And that shift gets more pronounced, more dramatic, the closer something is to your face. And the reason for that is that our two eyes see that image slightly differently. So if it's really, really close to your face, then from this eye, it looks like it's on the right, and this eye, it looks like it's on the left. So when we switch between them, we're seeing sort of opposite sides. So that disparity, that difference between what each eye is seeing, our brain puts it together and says, oh, there's a lot of difference between what they're seeing, so the object must be really close. Or if it's something really, really far away, once it's sort of out in the distance, we don't really have a lot of retinal disparity. So if it looks about the same, whether it's your right eye or your left eye, then it's far enough away that it doesn't matter. Our next one is convergence, and that's again operating on the idea that our eyes are going to sort of move to see things that are closer or further away. So again, with your finger in front of your face, as you bring your finger closer together, your eyes will sort of tilt inward. They will converge to look at things that are closer. So you start looking cross-eyed because you're looking at something that is very, very close to your face. And again, our brain can sense how much of that convergence is happening. How much are your eyes pushing in? Or if we're looking at something in the distance, are they sort of parallel to each other? And so we can detect how much convergence is going on to tell us how far away that thing is. And again, all of these cues are things that are going on in your brain that your brain has kind of figured out, but we're not necessarily aware of this. And so I find after I teach this lecture, I'm always sort of interested while I'm driving home about what we're perceiving and why, and most of it is just our brain doing stuff in the background without us knowing it. But the next thing we can talk about is more about how our brain processes stuff. So when we're looking at things, when we're looking at our environment, how do we decide what it is that we're looking at? And there are two major types of processing, again, sort of broad categories here. We can look at bottom-up processing or top-down processing. Bottom-up processing is starting with the basic building blocks. We look at each individual element or feature of a stimulus and try and figure out what it means. So maybe you look at something and it's round and it's orange and it has a textured surface. So you take all of those different sort of hints, all of those features, and put it together. So combine them into more complex forms. Okay, well, it looks like a ball, but it's maybe it's too small to be a ball or something like that. Maybe it's an orange, it's a fruit. So we could know from all of those features that we've put together, and that allows us to eventually recognize the stimulus. Now it seems kind of dumb that you wouldn't just look at an orange and know that it's an orange. That would come from something like top-down processing. Once you have that experience, once you are sort of used to understanding objects, once you're used to interacting with objects, you can use your background knowledge and your current sort of situation. You can use that awareness of what you should be seeing to kind of figure it out without starting at each individual element. So a great example of this are exit signs. You see exit signs pretty much every day of your life. And so when you glance at them, you don't necessarily look at each individual feature. The E has a vertical line with 3 horizontal lines, and the X has 2 crossing straight lines on an angle. You don't break it down at that level. You just see a sign. It's usually red, it's usually near a door. You assume it's an exit sign before it even registers what it says. You might then check that the features that you see actually match that. It's not, say, different letters that look kind of the same, but it's a marketing campaign or something, because people like to do that, where they get you to look at it twice. But you start with sort of that big picture. I know what it should be. You can do a quick check, and yeah, it's E, then X, then I, then T, and it's telling me where a door is. Cool, it's an exit sign. So for our bottom up, we start with individual details and put stuff together. Top down, we start with sort of our base knowledge and assumptions and can double check with the details. But there are 2 different ways of framing things to figure out what it is we're looking at. And as an example, so we already did our exit sign example, that's fine. But the one on the left here is an interesting way that our sort of bottom-up processing can lead to some tricks. So we can look at this drawing here and we see, yeah, there's an eye and there's sort of a head shape, but is that a beak or are those ears? What are those elements actually? And so now we have an ambiguous figure and we're going to try and figure out, well, is this a duck or is it a rabbit? And in the case of optical illusions like this, there is no right answer. But because we were trying to put those elements together, and we don't have any larger context to consider it in, we don't really know what it is. So it could be either and it could be both. All right, our next couple of topics come from Gestalt psychology. And so Gestalt was very interested in sort of classifying how we perceive things. How do we put stuff together in a way that makes sense? So the biggest principle here is that humans tend to perceive the whole of a scenario as a whole lot more than the individual sum of parts, which means that we get meaning from looking at it as a whole, as a unified piece, and it's more to it, there's more meaning there than if we just looked at each individual component separately. And so this is all talking about the fact that humans are really good at sort of making quick judgments, making connections, and sort of grouping things together in a particular way. And it can actually be very helpful because it can allow us to make judgments and can draw conclusions very quickly with minimal thought processes. but it also leads to a lot of the optical illusions and issues on that end of the scale that we run into fairly regularly. So the first of these is our perception of the figure versus the background, or the figure-ground relationship. And so I have a whole slide on this one here. So people are really, really good at deciding that there is a central figure or a focal point, something to focus in on, and a background, something of less importance. So maybe you focus on your instructor at the front of the room, but you ignore the blank wall behind them. So that would be our ability to pick out what's the figure and what's the irrelevant background. So we're usually very good at focusing on figures, but again, we can play with this a little bit and have these ambiguous figure-ground images where what is it that you're looking at? Which one is the focal point? Which one is the background? And again, there is no right answer. So if we start in the middle, is it a cup on a black background? Or is it two silhouetted faces with a sort of pink and white background? Is it, for the far right one, is it a face? Or is it a sort of landscape shot of a person walking? And then this one here, this one drives me nuts. I have taught this course for many years. It's supposed to be, is it a young woman looking away? Or is it an old woman with a scarf over her head? And I can never see the old woman. Again, I do this a couple of times a year, and it's just beyond me every single time. But I've been told from reliable sources that that's supposed to be, is it an old woman or a young woman? So these are ambiguous images where we can't decide which is the figure and which is the background, so our brains can't decide what to focus on. And so we end up sort of hopping back and forth between the two ways of framing it, because we can't pick out what's the correct answer, so we kind of jump between the two. And with a lot of these, you usually see one image first, and then as soon as you see the other option, you tend to sort of cycle back and forth between the two. Or, you know, if you're me, you get stuck on one and you never see the other one, and that's all it is for the next couple of years. All right. Okay, so the next couple of these, so the next 4 of them, I have a slide to talk about, and we'll hop over to that in just a second. But I do want to talk about the principle of common fate. And so this principle is one that I've only added this year because I hadn't seen it mentioned before. And it doesn't do great with images. You kind of need to see this one in motion, so I will describe it. But this is the idea that we tend to consider things that are moving or acting together as part of a single unit. The best example of this is a flock of birds. So if you've ever seen flocks of starlings, I don't know that they're up this far, but on the East Coast, they are absolutely everywhere. And they form massive flocks called murmurations, where you get thousands and thousands of birds traveling together. And they tend to move in these sort of predictable patterns, and it looks like a giant amorphous blob of flowing, moving dots. And so our brains interpret it as one large moving shape, and we almost ignore the fact that it's made up of thousands of individual birds. So that idea of common fate is that if they're moving together, if they're acting together, and if they have that pattern to them, we treat them as a single object, and we tend not to consider each individual element as part of it. And then for our other principles, the principles of similarity, proximity, closure, and continuity, this is another way of how we group things together, how we treat them as sort of something that should be considered together based on all these different things. So for our similarity example, we have a triangle of smaller circles. And so we group it as, okay, so we have all of these small circles, they form a triangle. Well, they're just technically a whole bunch of small circles, but we see them as a group. They are similar to one another, and so we treat them as an individual element that is now a triangle. For proximity, we could theoretically look at this as 3 short lines and 3 long lines, but because some of the lines are closer together than others, we tend to perceive this as 3 pairs of 2. So 3 pairs that have one short line and one long line because of their proximity to one another. So we associate things that are close to each other. For our law of closure, that's this assumption that we like to continue things. In nature, when we encounter shapes, you don't necessarily think that, so again, me standing at the front of the room, you can only see my upper body. You don't automatically assume that I am just a floating upper body. You assume that there's more to me and you just can't see it. So we fill in what's missing. You assume a full person. You assume a full circle, even though you can't see the whole image. So there's that base assumption that, okay, it's probably a continuous or a closed-in circle. We just don't have all the information. So our brain does that great job of filling in the gaps. And that's very close to our idea of continuity, where we tend to want to continue things. We tend to want to see movement and lines moving together. So we'd interpret that image as a line that goes from A to B and another line that goes from C to D, rather than, say, 2 separate sort of shark fin shapes that go from A to the middle to C and then D to the middle to B. We'd see that continuity of 2 nice continuous lines as opposed to some random shark fin shapes. And so these are just observations based on how people tend to group stuff together, how we tend to pull information from our environment. And the last thing I want to talk about are perceptual constancies. And so this is the idea that we assume that most of our environment is going to be fairly stable. So even though things look different, even though stimuli tend to change, we assume that it's not necessarily sort of big changes. We assume that it's something else going on. So let's give an example to kind of clear this up. The visual image here is actually kind of funny to think about. So when we look at the image in the middle, it's like, okay, so there's 2 people, they're sitting on chairs, one is closer to us and one is further away. We don't view that as one tiny human and one large human. We know that things that are further away tend to be smaller. So we assume that those 2 people are the same size. We don't assume that one is smaller than the other. And then when we move that person from the background into the foreground, when we kind of get rid of that perspective, those monocular cues that we have that give us sort of that size context, when we pull him out of that, in that second picture, it almost looks comically small. And you might find yourself thinking, no, that's too small. He's not actually that small in the original image. It's just they've made it even smaller. But if you got out a ruler and measured, the sort of background person, the person from in the sort of lighter shirt, he's the same size in both images. Even though from all of our sort of constancies and the way that our brain interprets information, he doesn't look nearly that small when he's in the image on the left. This also works for things like shape. So if you're having a conversation with a friend and they turn their head, so when they were looking straight on, they had sort of an oval-shaped face, and then when they turned to profile, now their face is a different shape. You don't assume that their face is changing shape. You just assume that they've turned, so your perspective is a little bit different. So you're looking at them from a different angle. It's not that it's changing in size or shape, it's just that you're moving relative to one another. This also works for brightness and hue, where we assume that even though, so we're sitting here under fluorescent lights, and my shirt looks this particular color. If we went out into the quad and it's sunny, so it would look slightly different because of a different light source. Or if we turned the lights off and lit a candle, it would look completely different. Both the color and the brightness would change based on how it's being lit. But we don't assume that I have some magical color-changing shirt. We assume that the lighting conditions are changing and that my shirt stays constant. And this also works for location in space. When I walk towards the back of the classroom, the chairs at the back of the room get larger, but I don't assume that they're moving towards me. I know that I'm moving, so I'm the motion part of this, and they are stationary. So that location in space, we make that assumption that we are the ones that are moving. And I actually had a student in my last class who mentioned a point when this can actually mess with your head. So if you drive, if you've ever been sitting at a light and you put your foot on the brake and you're waiting for the light to change and the car next to you starts to roll forward and you worry for a moment that you're rolling backwards because you assume that they're not moving, that you are, that's our location in space constancy messing with you. So it's a neat way to try and visualize that. But these are all just different ways that our brain does stuff in the background, and when it works great. It gives us shortcuts and allows us to sort of minimize the amount of processing power. But when it doesn't work, we end up with weird optical illusions and sort of feelings of panic thinking that our car is moving when it's not. So there's pros and cons to it. But we'll look at some more of this stuff when we get into consciousness. But yeah, so we'll start our next chapter on Wednesday. I forgot to mention at the beginning of class, Monday is Thanksgiving. Please don't come in on Monday. I'm hoping that by saying it in every class, I won't come in on Monday. But we'll see how that goes. So I will see you on Wednesday for the start of our next chapter. So enjoy your long weekend, everyone.